I'm gonna start. Okay. Hi, my name is Adelaide Spears. I'm a teaching artist at the Lawrence Art Center, and today I'm going to demo ceramic jewelry making. And I'm gonna go over a few methods, including using slabs and sculpting small animals, as well as how to put all the findings together. So when I start making ceramic jewelry, I always start with the nichrome wire because you need to put that into the clay pretty quickly. If the clay starts to dry, it's going to be hard and you could actually like crack the jewelry that you've been working on. So I like to start out by making this nichrome wire whatever shape I need it to be before I even start making all the jewelry. Nichrome wire is one of two wires that you can take up to cone 10 in a kiln without it melting. So if you use basic jewelry wire like sterling silver, that would melt at the temperatures that you're taking clay to in a kiln. I prefer to use nichrome wire, and this can go up to cone 10. I have seen it melt in a wood kiln before, but it was towards the back. So this is really the main wire that you're going to need to use to be able to attach your jewelry in the end. You can also just make holes in whatever jewelry you're making and then attach the wire after everything has been fired. But I find that that's a little bit more difficult, and it's easier to form loops to put into the clay instead. And I think that it also helps to not like obstruct your design, because if you're putting a hole into your piece, you kind of have to decide like where you want to mess the design up, where you're putting and placing that hole. So I find that nichrome wire is the best, and it can also be both functional and sculptural. So for this jewelry piece that I have here, it really is just functional. It's a loop so that I can later attach the sterling silver ear wire to put into your ear. But I also have been having fun making it more sculptural, so that it's not just something you're trying to ignore when you're looking at the jewelry, but actually adds to the design itself. And I really like this because it kind of like, I think it elevates the design a little bit more. So I'm going to show both methods, but no matter which type of, no matter whether I'm trying to use the nichrome wire as sculptural or functional, I'm going to do that first before I even start with my jewelry. So, I also prefer to use nichrome wire that's either 24 gauge or smaller. The way that wire works is the smaller the number, the thicker the wire is. And I find that if I'm using wire that's thicker than 24 gauge, it often cracks my jewelry. I'm trying to keep my jewelry thin enough that it's not gonna like weigh your ear down and is still light enough to actually wear. And if I use thicker nichrome wire, I'm gonna have to use a thicker slab, and that's not going to be as functional as jewelry. This, I'm guessing, is more of like 28 gauge. It's a little bit smaller than these pieces, which are 24. When I'm using sculptural, making it more sculptural, I do prefer to use probably 24 gauge, because sometimes the 28 or 30 gauge wire ends up being like a little flimsy. I do find that after the nichrome wire is fired, though, it does kind of harden a little bit. So that's helpful. It also does end up getting like a little grayer and scummier, and I'll show you guys later how I kind of clean that up and make it look better. So before I roll out a slab, I'm gonna cut this, and I always like to think about the fact that I'm trying to make pairs. I want the loop to match for the whole set of jewelry. So I am going to place the wire however tall I'm trying to make this loop. That's where I'm going to put the pliers, and then I'm just going to bend it around the pliers, and that's how I get that nice loop at the top. And then I'm going to cut it off right there. And I'm trying to remember where on the pliers I put the wire, because obviously the loop is going to be a lot bigger down here, and I want the loops to match for this set of earrings. I generally try to just like make all of them the same, but I think it's a little bit easier when you're thinking about making a pair, just doing that pair right then. I've had jewelry like dry out too much if I make a bunch of jewelry and I haven't done my nichrome wire, and then I'm like, oh crap, and then I'm trying to make the nichrome wire and then it's too dry to add it to, and it creates a lot of problems. So I'm just gonna make a couple more. If your wire is bent and is kind of like an odd shape, I really like these. They don't have any like grip or anything on the inside, so they're not going to mar the wire at all. And I'm just going to flatten this out to make it a little more uniform before I make that loop. And then I'm going to make the more sculptural one as well. So when I'm making a more sculptural jewelry piece with the nichrome, I am going to try to think about which design I'm doing. So for these butterflies or moths, since I actually have a template, I can kind of place the wire and kind of experiment with where I want it to go and how I want it to look. And once I have decided that, I'm gonna bend the wire. If you want it to be like a sharp end at the top, you can take these tweezers and actually like crunch them in the tweezers to get a finer point at the top. But if you want that more like, it just kind of looks like a loop and it's more gradual, I try to never squeeze them in the tweezers because it's kind of hard to get that kink out once you've made it. And then I'm gonna cut this and take my wire and just place it on top of itself so that I know I'm making it the exact same size. It's a lot more obvious, this style of adding nichrome wire to the jewelry. It's a lot more obvious if they don't match than with the loops. If they're slightly off, I don't really think it matters. It's not part of the design. But with this, it can be pretty obvious, especially to me when I'm looking at them. So I'm just making that kink kind of the same. And then I'm gonna hold the wire together as I cut it off so that I know that it is about the same length. And you always want to make sure that you're leaving enough extra wire for it to actually go into the clay. Luckily, as the clay shrinks and dries, and when you're firing, it shrinks again, it's going to shrink around that wire and you don't have to worry about it like coming out. But you do want to make sure that you insert the wire like at least, let's see, like that far. It's really, really small. Because the clay does shrink if you like barely place it into your clay, you know, it might like kind of shrink out of it, but it does help that you don't have to worry so much about the wire like wiggling out at any point, because it is just really getting like becoming a part of that clay through all of those firings as it shrinks. So the clay that I'm using today is the Cone 6 Laguna Frost. It's Laguna. I really, really love this clay for jewelry because it is very, very white and pretty, and you can get it extremely smooth. I love messing with my earrings as I'm wearing them, and I don't really want to have to always glaze the entire piece, but if it's Laguna Frost, then I can just sand it and it can become so smooth it almost feels like it's glazed on the back. And obviously you don't want to wear jewelry that's sharp or, you know, not good to touch. It's also, since it's white, it's really nice because whatever designs you put on it are going to show up. You don't have to add as many layers of underglaze. But I will say that it is a little bit, it can be a little annoying to work with. It does dry out pretty fast because it is a porcelain. But it's been so humid lately that I think that that's been working to my advantage. In the winter, it can be pretty difficult, and I'm always like spraying down my slabs as I'm working. But with the humidity that it's been out now, it's not really a problem. So when I roll out a slab for jewelry making, I really like to just do it by hand with a small roller. I don't use a slab roller, and I usually don't use guides. Like you can have like a ruler or something that are the same thickness on both sides, and then roll the slab so that you know the entire slab is that same thickness across. I don't like doing that because I'm trying to get my slabs pretty thin, and I really like to control the thickness of the slab myself. And when I'm working at such a small scale, you can kind of get away with things that you can't get away with when you're like slab building something big and structural. So I like to turn my slab as I roll it so that I am controlling the pressure, and because I'm turning it as I'm rolling it, each part of the slab is getting that same amount of pressure, and it's kind of helping to keep it uniform. If I'm just rolling it in one direction, I think it's a lot easier to like mess up, and maybe I'm using more pressure at the beginning as I'm rolling. But because I'm turning it, the whole slab is going to get like that same push over my roller. I'm also flipping it for back and forth as well. Something else that's really nice about hand rolling a slab rather than doing a slab roller is that clay is made of all of these tiny platelets, and when they're aligned on top of each other, your clay is really strong, and compression is like very necessary in ceramics to help get all of those to align nicely. Um, and when you roll it through a slab roller, you're kind of mushing the clay in only one direction, and so the compression is not very good. But because I'm rolling my slab in multiple different directions, it's helping to get those little platelets to align and be stronger. Clay also has a memory. If I took this slab right now and I like did a bunch of weird stuff with it, and then I just like sat it down and made my jewelry, the clay might remember me like wiggling it and want to not sit flat and nice and uniform. So this also kind of helps, like the memory, it likes to go back to whenever it was the strongest, and so by rolling it this way, I'm also kind of compressing those platelets together and saying this is when this clay was at its strongest, and it helps it to want to stay flat. But I'm also going to compress it with a rib to just help and make it stay as flat as possible. It's really annoying to work on something really hard and then have it come out of the kiln and be all wonky. So I'm going to take my metal rib. I like to dip it in a little bit of water because it helps it glide over the surface of the clay. And I'm going to do this both directions on both sides of the slab. Something that's also nice about this is if you're using clay that's not straight out of the bag, that might have some like air bubbles in it from doing previous things with your clay, compressing it really helps you see those air bubbles that you might otherwise not see if you're not compressing it. It's also giving me a much smoother surface to work on. Even though this canvas texture, I don't get like a ton of it, it does kind of show up, and so this is helping me smooth out that canvas texture as well. And I do see a few air bubbles in my slab, so I'm going to take either a needle tool or an X-Acto knife, and there's my X-Acto knife. I'm just gonna poke those air bubbles, and then I'm going to recompress my clay, and that's gonna kind of pop the air bubbles out of the clay. You don't want air bubbles in your clay because those can grow in the kiln and just really mess up your piece. Kind of looks like a bubble forming, and they can like pop out and kind of explode. So I'm gonna flip it to the other side too, just to make sure I don't see any air bubbles. And this slab is really, really thin, as you guys can see. This is the thickness that I like to make all of my slab pieces at. This clay is going to shrink. I believe it's like almost 20%. It shrinks quite a bit because it is a porcelain. So I am going to keep that in mind, that I don't want to make it like so thin that it's just going to snap. Even if it was fired all the way and I made something incredibly thin, it could be very, very fragile. But I want to keep in mind that these are going to be worn by someone, and I don't want them to just, pull on your earlobe and be way too thick to wear. So I want to keep these slabs on the thinner side for that reason. I'm also going to carve these a little bit, so I don't want to make it so thin that I don't have room to do that. And there's a few different methods for cutting out shapes when you're making slab jewelry. I have templates that I've made myself, like this one here. So I just drew this shape and then I cut it out. I really like using note cards or any kind of thicker paper like cardstock. If I make templates on just like basic copy paper, they pretty much get ruined after you use them like once because the water will soak into the paper. I have made several templates for myself that I cut out of vinyl as well, because those are gonna like last pretty much forever unless I accidentally cut them. This is still gonna break down after a while. So sometimes I'll make like multiple copies, or I'll just go find my vinyl and like actually make myself one that's gonna last longer. If you have a Cricut or any kind of vinyl cutting machine, you can even make your own little templates out of that, and it's very nice. I have one that I even had the machine like cut circles out of, so that it even shows me like where I need to paint certain lines, which is very helpful when you're trying to make a lot of jewelry. I also have this cloud, and then the other methods are this, which I can just follow on the inside and cut shapes. And then I also have these, which I think they're Kemper tools. Yeah, they're really nice and super helpful for cutting out shapes. So I'm gonna start with this. I have noticed that like I accidentally dented one of these at some point, and I'm trying to make like a perfect circle, so that's not very helpful. But I found that if I just turn them, it's gonna make the circle be okay and the dent will go away, unless you like, you know, totally mess up the circle. I have also found that, especially with these cutters, it can be really helpful to put a little bit of cornstarch on your slab before you cut into it, because the clay often likes to stick on the metal. And even though these tools have a little thing so that you can push the clay out, often that leaves marks on my jewelry that I don't want. And sometimes, especially like you're working with wet clay, sometimes it'll mess up the shape as you're pushing it out. I think that that would probably work better if this piece of metal was like the size of the entire circle, but it kind of just makes a little indent circle in the middle. So I'm trying to, as I'm cutting into this, I want it to release and be on the canvas still and not in my cookie cutter. So I'm just gonna rub a little bit of cornstarch on my slab. Not a lot, just enough that like I can feel it's not sticking to my fingers anymore. And then I'm gonna grab my tool and I'm gonna turn it as I cut down, and then I'm not gonna push it all the way down onto my canvas. I can feel that it's almost all the way through, and then I'm gonna lift it so that it stays in my slab. Otherwise, it might come up with the tool. So you can see, if I just cut right into it in the area that I didn't do cornstarch, it's stuck into the tool. And then when I push it out, that makes it not really flat anymore, and I have that circle indent. You can kind of compress that away with a tool sometimes, but often that, as I'm trying to fix this indent, it will make the circle not circular anymore. So it's just easier to make it stay on the slab instead. I'm gonna cut a pair. And then when I'm trying to release shape from the slab, I like to kind of cut a guide with my X-Acto knife so that I can pull the clay away from it. It's really helpful. And because I didn't cut all the way through, I also am going to go around the edge of my circle to help release that. So the edges of this circle are not very clean, and if clay is sharp, it can actually cut you once it's fired all the way. And obviously with jewelry, we don't want that to be sharp anymore. And I also want it to look cleaner. So right after I cut shapes from the slab, I'm gonna take my finger and I'm just gonna clean up that edge a little bit. And I'm just compressing it just very gently with my finger. And that little bit of water just helps my finger glide around the surface of the clay. Otherwise it would stick and make this a lot more difficult. I'm holding this very, very gently. I'm not trying to squish it or mess it up. and then I'm gonna set it aside. The edges are not perfect, but that's okay for now. Because it's still very, very wet, you could like mess it up at this stage and make it not flat if you handle it too much. So I'm gonna wait to clean it up more once this piece starts to get to leather hard. And leather hard is when the piece is still wet enough that you can do things to it, and you can like kind of change the shape if you try, but it might crack. But it's dry enough that it's not sticking to my fingers anymore, and I can lift it and it's not going to try to change shape. It's dry enough that it's going to like stay fairly flat. I still have to be careful with it, but it's a much easier state to work with because it's not as floppy as it is now, and I don't want to wait for my clay to be completely bone dry, which is when all of the water has come out of your clay. This piece is bone dry right now, and it kind of looks like a bone color, like it's kind of dusty. Pieces are their most fragile when they're at bone dry out of all of the ceramic process, and so I really don't want to mess with them at this stage because the chances of me messing up the edges, even if I'm like scrubbing carefully with a sponge, I could totally crack and ruin this piece. So leather hard is the best stage to clean up any weird edges or mistakes that I've made, because I try to like touch the piece as little as possible at that bone dry stage. And I have a piece here that's drying, so I can show you guys cleaning up at that stage in a little bit. And then after I clean up the edges of my jewelry, I am going to put the nichrome wire in right now. I don't want to wait. Well, obviously bone dry would not work. At leather hard, I found trying to put nichrome in is going to probably crack the piece because it's still dry enough that you just can't get it in. So I'm going to grab my nichrome wire now, and I'm going to push it into my jewelry. Something I want to be careful of as I'm doing this is I'm trying to get this nichrome wire like halfway in this part of the slab, like how thick the slab is. I want it halfway through the thickness of the slab. If I put it too far towards the top or bottom, it could totally like show through. Sometimes it can also crack if it's too close to the surface, and as that clay shrinks in the firing, it just doesn't have enough room to shrink along that wire, which is the same thing that happens if you use nichrome wire that's too thick. The clay is trying to shrink too much, and it doesn't have room to shrink along that wire. So I'm trying to get it in halfway so that it doesn't show. And then I'm gonna push it in so that the loop isn't like really large, because this is just functional and there's no like sculptural this loop is literally just to attach it to an ear wire. I don't want it to be like really huge. I don't want it to distract from my design. So I'm just gonna push it in enough that I know I have room to attach an ear wire to it, but I don't want to leave a bunch of it out when it's just completely unnecessary. Then I'm gonna grab the twin of that nichrome wire and do it again. Halfway in. And now I'll show you guys the other methods of cutting the slab. So I am going to just place this onto my slab. It doesn't really matter if you use cornstarch when you're cutting with an X-Acto knife, because you're just literally cutting along the edge. And I guess maybe your template won't stick as much if you use cornstarch, which is kind of nice. But with this template, I actually like to just barely make marks in the clay with it, because I have a few different things on my template that I want to carve into my piece later. So I have the lines of the wings and the body and a few of these other marks. And this paper template, which is kind of why I like to use paper, it does have burrs on the other side where I have drawn those marks. And if I put it onto my slab and I just rub it slightly, I'll actually see those marks in the clay. And then after I cut it out, that works as a guide for me later when I am carving into it. So this one that I'm not going to cut out, you guys can maybe see that you can see the outline. You could also take the template off and then cut the outline out without the template sitting there, because I do have those lines that show the outside of the template as well in my clay. But I find that it's just nice to have a guide here. And I'm not gonna I'm making sure not to cut into my template, so it shouldn't mess my template up at all to have it here. I'm making sure that I'm holding the template as I'm cutting around it. I don't want it to move and mess me up. And then I'm gonna do the same thing and kind of cut the slab away from this piece. It's stuck a little bit right there. I can just cut it off with my X-Acto knife. Something else to mention is that it's actually really nice in pottery to have rusty X-Acto knives. And I really like taking the X-Acto knife blades from the print studio at the art center that they say are too dull and they don't want anymore, and using them. And it's like, there's like hundreds of free X-Acto knife blades down there. And the reason that having a slightly more dull, rusty blade is nice is that the clay doesn't want to stick to the rust. And so if you have like a really new, shiny X-Acto knife, as you're cutting, the clay is going to try to stick to it and it's going to mess up your design. But if it's rusty, it can glide past that clay. It's kind of like cornstarch. So I'm going to cut this out and then clean the edges up slightly. And these wings don't totally match right now, but that's something that I can fix later. Just very gently cleaning up these edges. And then if I was going to use the more sculptural nichrome wire, I'm just going to make sure that it's like, it got a little wonky. So I'm just using my pliers to flatten it back out again. And then I can put it in the clay. So put it up here. And it can be a little trickier to put nichrome wire like this into your clay. When you're pushing this loop in, it's pretty easy to just get both ends to go in at the same time. But with one that's bigger like this, it can be a little more difficult. So I usually like to position it where I want it to be, and then I'm gonna do one end at a time. I'm gonna push that in a little bit, and then I'm gonna push this one in a little bit. And this really helps me make sure that I'm getting it halfway into that slab. Otherwise, if I try to push them both in at the same time, usually that wire is not the same place along my slab, and I might accidentally put the wire like too close to the back or front of the slab and cause all of those issues that I talked about. So there's the sculptural element. And then the last method is very similar to what I just did. I have this really nice metal, I guess like guide here with all these different shapes, and the fact that it's metal is really, really helpful. I'm not gonna accidentally like cut it, and it's really simple. Just cut it out and release the shape from the slab. And then I can clean up those edges. Something else I wanted to show is how I add an additional piece of clay onto that part of this design. And that can be a little bit tricky. So it's in the same time that I'm adding this onto my moth. Normally I would get that ready at the same time as my moth. And I use that by I make that moon by just using one of these cutters. Actually, I don't want to put it in water. I'm gonna add a little more cornstarch to the slab and then just cutting that moon shape out. And there we go. Occasionally the slab still likes to stick into the tool. So I've got my little circle. I like to cut it into a moon before I clean up the edge, because I'm gonna have to clean up how the moon looks as well. So I just cut out that shape to form it into a moon. I'm gonna try to be really, really careful with the very edges of that moon shape because they are so small and delicate. But I am gonna use my fingers and just lightly tap them so that they're not sharp. Because since it's coming to a point, it could be sharp after all of the firing is done, and I don't want that. And I'm just gonna redo this. So I am going to first take my moon and slide it on to whichever side of the design I want it to be. I'm going to slide the wire all the way through the moon, which can be fairly difficult to get it to stay at the right angle so that it's halfway in that slab and not, you have to be very careful about inserting it and like really just keeping it at the same angle as you're going all the way through, because it's pretty easy to accidentally make it so that it goes too far to one side or the other as you're doing that. And then once I have that on, I have to be very careful. The nice thing is that it's not going to slide off. The clay is like sticky enough that it's keeping that moon on. And then get that on that side and that side. And there I have it. It is a little bit more difficult to, I shouldn't have touched it like that, to clean up that moon once I'm in that stage to clean the clay up. So I usually have to be a little more careful, and I usually try to clean it up with my fingers a little bit more just to make sure that I'm not going to have to like more aggressively clean it up, because the chances of it wanting to snap off of that wire even at bone dry or at leather hard stage is kind of higher, because that nichrome wire is going all the way through it. Just checking the time. Any questions so far about that?
The other end of the wire on the moon going into the butterfly?
Yes, it did. Yeah. Yeah, and I really should have made the moon smaller for this guy, or made the nichrome wire taller, but because it does not have a lot of room to go into it, but normally I wouldn't be handling it like that. Yeah. Yeah, so I would do that same thing and insert it into both sides. Now I've like messed with it too much. It doesn't look good. I do try to make the wire a little bit extra long when I'm doing an extra piece on that wire as well, because I will have to have room to put it into the piece as well, like you said. And I'm still having to insert it that same distance into the clay as normal. So it is nice to have just more wire to work with. And it's okay to like, you need to put at least like that much in the clay, but it's okay if you put more in, you just don't want to go through the other side. Like sometimes I cut my sculptural nichrome wire out and then I realize that it's kind of extra long, and so I just, maybe it goes in a little bit further into the wings. But as long as it's still sitting in the middle of that slab, it's not a problem. It's not going to break the piece. It's totally okay. You can also add nichrome wire and it not be the part of the clay that the ear wire is attaching to. Like I could totally just add nichrome wire for fun coming out of the moth, or in this piece here, I attached a moon to the bottom with the nichrome wire and I still have a loop at the top that is just to attach the piece. So, and I did make this loop a little bit extra big because it is where the moth has antenna, so I was like, maybe that's kind of sculptural as well. Something I also wanted to show was how to make pieces that are like stacking or multiple, an earring that has like multiple parts to it. So there's kind of two main ways that I would do that. One is a little more difficult, but I personally like more because I feel like it's more secure. And then the other one is easier. So the more difficult one I did here on these lemon and lime earrings. And I have nichrome wire that is just looped around each other in this earring here. And it can just dangle. And the reason I like doing this method is that the other method, you are attaching them after they've been fired with something called a jump ring. And the jump ring is never like soldered together, so it could sometimes work its way free and have that second part of your jewelry fall. I try to make them like very secure, and I use the pliers and close the jump ring all the way, but sometimes it still just doesn't feel as secure to me. Whereas this way, that wire is not going to come out of that clay. It's fully fired into the clay. It's completely secure. It's not going to be able to fall out. So I'll just pass this around so you guys can see. But it does mean that it's a little more difficult to work with the wire to get that effect. So I start with just 2 loops like normal. And if I'm making a jewelry that has multiple parts like that, I am gonna have to add extra loops in sometimes. So like the first, I think it's the lemon on that jewelry piece. It has a loop at the top and the bottom. So I am going to make 6 loops for that one piece of jewelry. Except that I'm not gonna make you guys watch me make both parts, both earrings. So I'm just gonna make 3 identical loops. So for the loop that goes at the top, I don't have to worry about it. It's gonna just hang out there and be the way that I attach the ear wire into my piece. So I'm just gonna set that aside. For the other one that is going, the line that's attaching to the lemon that has, that is the attachment point, I am going to change that one. So I'm gonna just set that one aside. I have these 2, and I'm gonna loop them through each other because this just kind of helps me know that I'm doing it correctly. And the top one is gonna really just stay the same. It's just going to go into that piece just like this, you know, and just like hang out there. But the bottom piece, I want my lime and lemon to sit the same and face the same way, but I can't have this sticking in this way because I don't have enough room in my slab. My slab isn't thick enough to have the prongs going in the opposite direction of my slab. So I'm going to bend those wires, and I don't do it while it's in the clay, I just was showing that. I'm going to bend those wires and twist them so that they are going the opposite way at the end. So I want the top of the loop to go around this loop at that point, so they're going in opposite directions. And then I want the bottom of this loop to twist so that it's going the same direction as the prongs on the top. So I'm gonna hold it. And the easiest way to do this is just to twist it so that the prongs actually cross each other. And then I can test it, make sure it's going the right direction. And then I like to take my pliers and kind of flatten them out. And then if they need to be bent anymore, the pliers are super helpful for that because I can hold the loop with my finger and kind of bend them just to make sure that they're going in that opposite direction properly. So here, let me pass that around so you guys can see. And if the prongs end up being like slightly different lengths, that's going to be okay because they're just going to go into that slab and disappear and you won't see them anymore. So that is the way that I made those. I can show you guys how I put it in the clay when that comes back around to me. But the other method is, let's say I'm making these 2 into a 2-part earring. I'm just going to put those I'm just going to put the nichrome wire in like normal, except that the top one is going to have 2 loops in it. And I want to make sure that I'm putting those in at the same part of the clay so that it looks good and like visually is nice. And then I'm just going to put an extra loop into this guy. And then after it's fired, I can attach those with the jump ring. Versus, is this the, yeah. If I am doing the 2-part where I twist the wire, I am going to put the 2 loops in this guy. I'm going to slip this wire through. It's kind of best to do that before putting it in the clay. So I've got that wire through this guy, and then I'm going to try to very carefully put it in the second part of my piece, the second part of my earring, while I'm holding onto this guy. So this is a little bit hard because I'm trying to keep this one nice. I don't want to use so much pressure that I mess up the slab in any way. So I'm holding it very delicately, and then I'm going to take the second part of my earring, which normally it would be one that I cleaned up and actually looks nice, and very carefully put that into the second part. And then to make sure the nichrome wire like actually stays in there, I'm not gonna like pick it up and hold it and dangle it and make sure that it's fine. I'm just gonna set it aside. In bone dry, I could do that, but right now, this is kind of, the second part is a little bit heavy. And even though the nichrome wire wants to stay in the clay, because the clay is like wet and kind of grippy, there's enough weight there that if I hold them up right now in greenware, it might just slip out. So I'm just gonna set them aside and be careful. And then I'm gonna show you guys how to use a jump ring to attach two pieces. So I have these two random fire pieces here. Let's say that I want to attach them like this, even though they don't have an extra hoop. We'll just pretend they do. I have some jump rings right here. I like to use sterling silver for all of my jewelry because I have a metal allergy, and if I don't use sterling silver or gold, my ears get really, really mad, and they even get mad with those. So I just try to do all sterling silver. And the jump ring, even though it's not going to be like in somebody's ear, I like to have them match the ear wire that I'm going to use so that it looks more uniform. The nichrome wire is going to be a slightly different color anyway, so I'd rather it all look nice. So I have a jump ring here that's already pre-made, but the way that you make jump rings yourself, if you ever want to make them out of a different wire, or maybe you have sterling silver wire, is you take the wire and some pliers. You want these pliers that are like cylinders so that they're round because you're making a round jump ring. And I'm gonna hold the wire in my plier like this, and then I'm gonna wrap it around to form a circle, and then I'm gonna put the wire back into as I wrap it around, I'm gonna put the wire in between the pliers again to make a second ring. And I like to like kind of turn the wire and squeeze the pliers together just to make sure that it's nice and like circular. And then if I want to make like a bunch of jump rings at once, I can just slowly thread the wire onto the plier. Does that make sense? I'm just turning them and opening them ever so slightly. So this would make like 7 jump rings at once. And then I am going to cut this off. And I only have wire cutters right here in my pliers. But if you have wire cutters that are not in pliers, you can get the wire cutter into the inside of the jump ring and just like cut all of them at once. But because I don't have that, it's a little bit harder, and I'm gonna have to cut a jump ring off like one at a time. So I just got the edge of my wire in there and then cut the jump ring. This guy has like the extra end of my wire there, so I'm just gonna kind of reshape it because it was a little wonky at the edge there. And I can just reshape it by twisting it through my pliers again. And then if your jump ring is ever like this, where it's like, it's not flat, like it's kind of twisted still, I can just place that into my wire, my other pliers that are flat. And now that's a nice jump ring that is not all wonky and weird. And anytime you open a jump ring, you don't want to twist them. Like if this is the loop, you don't want to do this because you're going to make it no longer circle. You're going to mess it up. You want to twist it like this to the side, not away from each other. So I'm going to take the end of my jump ring and twist it to the side. And then my jump ring is open, and I can slip it into one part of my jewelry, into the other part, and then I'm going to twist it closed again. And I always like to kind of push the wire together ever so slightly with my pliers, and then take my pliers and put the loop into them and just kind of like push down a little bit, just to try to make sure that that jump ring is completely closed and secure. Normally I would also be making a jump ring out of wire that is thicker than this, because this is that 28 gauge wire that's like fairly flimsy. So I would say do 24 gauge or thicker. This, I believe, is like 22 gauge wire. So you can see it's a lot thicker and more substantial. And it actually is already open where the two sides are pulled away from each other. So to close this, I would just take my pliers, push them back together. I like to hold the pliers on one end and hold it. Sometimes it's nice to have like two sets of pliers. I could hold the other side with these pliers and just barely kind of try to push that together, and then just make sure that they're closed as much as possible. And then I always double check them as well, because if that wire isn't totally open and the gap for that jump ring is big enough that your nichrome could slip through it, you could lose that second part of your jewelry. And especially when you're making jewelry out of clay, if that falls on the ground, it's probably going to break. I have found that the slab pieces usually do shatter if they fall on the ground, but I have a few pieces. I don't think I have any up here right now, but I have some mushrooms and they bounce. Even though they're made out of clay, I've dropped them on concrete and they bounce. Still not ideal though, even if they don't break.
Do you ever seal that jump ring with glue or fix cement?
Usually not. That could maybe help. I do feel like the jump ring is turning and kind of rubbing on the other wires a lot though, so I'm not sure if the glue would like really stay. Yeah. Another thing that I do with slab jewelry is you can make studs. And I am not going to make studs out of nichrome wire because I don't want nichrome wire in my ears, and I'm not sure if that would really stay well. So I just don't worry about it while I'm making my piece. So if this is a stud, I'm just not going to put any nichrome wire in it. It's going to be totally nichrome wire free, and I am going to buy little stud pieces and glue them onto that slab. So I really like the brand Rio Grande for getting those little studs. There's a lot of jewelry supply stores that have all of those different jewelry making things. Like you can buy the pre-made jump rings, you can buy pre-made ear wires like this, and then you can buy the backs for studs. And those, I've found it can be hard sometimes to find those pre-made backs that are small enough for the size of jewelry I'm making. I think I kind of like smaller jewelry and all my studs are like this size or smaller. Otherwise, I'm like, I'd rather just make them dangle because that feels like a lot for a stud. So I just buy those pre-made backs, and I have found that the best way to attach them, you do need to use like a glue or epoxy, but they're like in your ear, you might be touching your ear, you know, you're taking them on and off, and that's kind of asking a lot for that bond between the glue and your piece. So I've found the best method for making sure they're attached really well is to actually take the metal back that I'm going to use and sand it on some sandpaper to create a bunch of little grooves in that metal that the glue can actually attach to. Otherwise, it's just like, if it's like a slick, perfectly finished metal, that glue doesn't want to attach. It's not a good attachment. And I also don't sand the back of my studs because I like that there is some of that texture. And I've even sometimes used like a tool like this to make some marks in the back of that stud to help create a place for that glue to adhere to. I've also found, I've tested like every single epoxy. I have a bunch of random ones that I'm not going to use, and I found that the best glue to attach a stud with is called Epoxy 330, and it is a jewelry epoxy that a lot of like metal smiths use to attach things. Like I'm pretty sure if you get like a pearl ring, like that's what they're attaching the pearl onto the metal of your ring is. So it's just, I think that finding an epoxy that is going to bond to ceramics is not that hard. It's like the metal part. It's the metal back that always comes off. Like every time I've had a stud come off, it comes off on the metal and the glue stays onto my ceramics. So really sanding them is super helpful. I'm kind of running out of time, so the last thing I'm going to go over is making tiny animal sculptural jewelry. I didn't put one of those up there, but the donuts is kind of the same thing, where I'm not making that from a slab, I'm making that just from the clay. So I'm gonna grab a little bit of fresh clay. This is getting a little bit dried out. And the first thing I always do, other than my nichrome, is if I, like, let's say I'm trying to make this duck shape, I always look at that animal and I'm going to kind of break it into shapes. So especially if I'm trying to make like a matching pair of earrings, if I kind of think about, okay, so I can roll a ball for that, and I can roll a ball for the body, and then I can elongate it with my fingers. I can make those 4 balls ahead of time. They're the exact same size, so that the earrings will actually match, and the ducks on both sides of your ears are going to match. Now, for like a necklace or something that's not a pair of, it might not matter so much, but this also helps me with like the ratio, because I know that the body is a lot bigger than the head, so it helps to make these ahead of time so that I can make that ratio, right? So I usually just start with like a random amount of clay that I think is right, and then I can take some off. And sometimes making these little like animals as earrings is hard because I'm using a little bit more clay, and I want to make sure that they're still not going to weigh your ears down. So I'm gonna start out with this. Always try to make sure this is the head. I'm trying to make these the same amount of clay. That looks pretty good. Just gonna roll them on my hand. And that looks pretty good. So I'm gonna take a little bit of water on my hands to make the body of the duck. And I'm just gonna very lightly pull to get the tail. And I like to keep my hands wet so that my fingers can actually slide. And sometimes this kind of makes like a little bit of slip on the surface of the clay, and then if your hand is dry, it's like marring the surface and like making it not smooth anymore. So and now with the head, I want a beak, and I could just add like a little bit of slip to the head to make a beak, but I've actually found that I can kind of pull the beak off of that little head the same method that I did with the tail feathers. So I'm gonna get my fingers wet, and I'm just gonna pull a little bit to make that beak. And then obviously I'm messing up the rest of the shape of the head, so it can kind of help to like pronounce the beak and get more clay to it I'm just gonna use my needle tool and run it around the edge of that beak. It's just kind of helping me to pull that clay where I need it to be, and it kind of also pronounce that beak a little bit more. And then I can just use my fingers to smooth that down. I can roll it on my hand a little bit again. And I kind of mentioned this before, but what's nice about making stuff at this scale is that you can break some of the rules. So I don't really need to slip and score this piece. You'll notice that I don't really have any slip with me right now, because it's still the clay is still wet enough and it's so small. I can just add water and then take the head and add it on. And then as long as I am still kind of mushing the clay from both the head and the body, I can attach it well enough without slipping and scoring that it's not a problem. I really like my needle tool. Every time I'm making little tiny animals, it's really helpful for like adding any sort of lines onto your piece, and it makes it a lot easier to attach. So I'm just kind of scooping the clay towards the head, towards the body, and I can kind of wiggle the head and make sure it's good. And then I can go back and like fix that beak a little bit. I want to make sure it's not sharp, but I don't want it to look weird. And then I can go back and kind of fix that tail a little bit more again. I do have like this sculpting tool can kind of help as well, but sometimes I find that it leaves more marks on the clay than the needle tool because this is circular, so it doesn't have any edges, whereas this does. And I don't want, a bunch of marks on him. And then if I want, I could even add wings. I can take a little bit of clay, roll it into a ball, pinch it, pull it again with my fingers. And then again, I just can add water. I don't need to slip and score. And I can add that onto the side there. And then I'm just gonna run along the edge with my needle tool to compress that together. And I'm on my way to having a duck. I feel like the tail is getting a little weird, so I could even add some clay back onto him as long as I mush that clay in together. Something else that I like to mention is that I really prefer, if I am going to paint my jewelry, I want to get 1 or 2 layers on before it gets bisked. Because I find that, one, if you paint a bunch of underglaze onto your piece before you glaze fire it onto the bisque ware, a lot of times it kind of resists the clay or resists the glaze. You might notice like if you've painted onto like a mug and then you've put multiple layers of underglaze and then you dip it in the glaze. Sometimes it like takes forever for it to actually like cover that glaze or cover that underglaze. Sometimes you have to come in and paint more glaze onto that underglaze spot for it to not actually show through. And then I've also found that sometimes after it's fired, it's not very smooth. It's like the underglaze got just sort of resisted that glaze. You don't have a perfect smooth surface. It feels different than the rest of the clay. Sometimes I see little like bubbles almost. So I find that if I get a nice layer of underglaze onto my piece before I ever bisque it, that underglaze is adhered to that clay then, and it doesn't end up resisting the glaze. I've also found that I have to use less layers. It's like it soaks into the clay better, and I'm sure people that have done clay before and have used underglaze, like you notice that you have to use a few layers to not get brush strokes. And I found that if I paint at least 1 layer on before I bisque it, I'm way less likely to see those brush strokes, and I only have to do 1 layer before I glaze fire it. So I'll do 1 or 2 before bisque fire, 1 after bisque fire, and I glaze it. The glaze doesn't want to resist. It's a much better layer. And sometimes I don't even do an additional layer before I glaze it. If I get multiple layers on in the underglaze or in the greenware stage, it just really helps it be in that clay and not look very brush strokey. And then one last thing, I'm going to show you guys how I clean these up. So this guy feels very bone dry now, or not bone dry, it's leather hard. I made this one like right before I started my demo, so that took about an hour to get to the right stage. With jewelry making, sometimes I'll like make a few pieces, run and do something else, and then run back. I feel like a lot of clay just feels like getting stuff at the right stage. You're always waiting for something to dry. So now that it's leather hard, I can come in with a sponge and just clean up any edges. If I have like a sharp edge from where I cut the slab out, the piece out of the slab, sometimes that sharp edge wants to continue to dry and form a crack into your clay. So I want to come in with either a sponge or a tool like my needle tool and just make that edge no longer sharp. I don't want it to be like a V. I want it to be rounded off so that that line doesn't want to continue to come in and crack. And it can still be like very pronounced. I just don't want it to end in a very sharp edge. So sometimes I prefer to use this mud tool, this really nice white sponge. This one is it's more fine and it's gonna give you a smoother surface, but these like classic yellow ones are going to take more clay away from the surface of your piece. So if I have like this piece right here, I have some clay that I don't want hanging out on the edge. This is gonna take that away a lot quicker. But if I am trying to make it like super smooth so that when it's all the way done and fired, I don't have to sand it very much, then I'm gonna go in with this guy. So usually I like to start with the yellow one to get any, big spots of clay smoothed out. It's also really good for taking the slab texture off. This one you're gonna have to scrub a lot longer with. This one is gonna take that, not the slab texture, the canvas texture away. Because if you are compressing your slab on both sides, when you flip it and you compress it again, you're going to get a little bit of canvas texture on that slab. So I'm going to come in with this guy, just make sure all those edges are clean. And I do feel like this wing is maybe more indented than this wing. And so I really like the edge of the slab, or the edge of the sponge, to clean that up and make those more even. And then this is the stage that I also would carve into my piece if I want to make any marks in it. So I have, these tools you can totally carve onto a tiny slab piece as long as you don't go through it, just barely going into that surface. And I also really like the X-Acto knife for making marks into the slab. So this would be the stage in which I would carve those marks. Any questions about anything I've gone through? Well, that's my demo. Thanks for listening.